Welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 931st New Social Environment. I'm Carolyn, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Jenn Bratovich, Rosenblum, Christine Weyl, and Jennifer Field. We are thrilled to welcome our Programs Director, Chloe Stagaman, here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we're speaking from. And now to introduce today's guests and host. Jenn Bratovich is Director of Exhibitions and Programs at Print Center New York, where she works with artists, publishers, curators, writers, and arts programmers to think about print. Since joining Print Center New York, she has helped shepherd the organization through its move to a new ground floor exhibition space, sharpened the organization's curatorial vision and grown its capacity, and led development of a new exhibition and artist development program to support emerging artists. She has previously held positions at Hunter College Art Galleries and Women's Studios Workshop and holds an MA in Art History from Hunter College. Rosenblum is the Jensen Bryan Curator of the Print Center Philadelphia. She has worked in curatorial departments at the Philadelphia Museum of Art and Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, a doctoral candidate in art history at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. Rosenblum is writing a dissertation on the rise of mid-20th century collaborative lithography in the United States. Christina Weyl is a New York-based curator. She has organized numerous exhibitions and published widely about 20th century printmaking and women artists. Her book, The Women of Atelier 17, Modernist Printmaking in Mid-Century New York, from Yale University Press, highlights nearly 100 women artists who advanced modernism and feminism at Atelier 17, the avant-garde printmaking studio located in New York City between 1940 and 1955. In 2014, she co-founded the Association of Print Scholars, a nonprofit professional organization. She holds a PhD in art history from Rutgers University. And our host today, Jennifer Field, is Executive Director at the Estate of David Smith. She has held curatorial and research positions at De Donna Galleries, the Willem de Kooning Foundation, and the Museum of Modern Art, New York. Her projects have included the exhibition Songs of the Horizon, David Smith Music and Dance, Surrealism in Mexico, and several others. Dr. Field received her MA from Hunter College and her PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts, NYU. Her dissertation examines episodes in printmaking among mid-20th century New York school painters. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you, Jenn.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Halloween. I'm very glad to be here and to celebrate the exhibition, A Model Workshop, Margaret, Lowengrund, and the Contemporaries. For those of you who haven't seen it yet, I strongly encourage you to visit before the exhibition closes on December 23rd. Carolyn, maybe this is a good chance to pull up the slide, which has some information about the exhibition. The show examines Margaret Lowengrund's ambitious yet under-recognized career as an illustrator, printmaker, and writer, as well as an entrepreneur dedicated simultaneously to providing opportunities to artists for printmaking and to cultivating a market for those prints through a workshop and gallery known as the Contemporaries that she established on the Upper East Side in 1951. The exhibition is accompanied by an excellent catalog by the co-curators, Christina Weyl and Rosenblum, along with authors Ellen J. Benjamin, Jillian Russo, Sarah Archer, Noriko Kuwahara, and Rachel Vogel. When I first learned about this project in its early stages, I thought, finally, because in my own research in the past, I had found it difficult to locate information about Lowengrund, despite her central role in print history. As Christina and Lauren point out in the catalog, there is little archival material and no single published source on her or the Contemporaries. As the authors also note, Lowengrund died prematurely of cancer in 1957, which cut short her renown. The exhibition is therefore dependent on valuable original research and fills an egregious gap, not only in the history of printmaking, but in art history, and especially in the United States. During this conversation, I will address specific speakers in my questioning, but after that prompt, speakers, please feel free to expand the dialogue organically among yourselves. I would like to discuss Lowengrund and some historical background first. Then toward the end of the event, I will move into asking for your insights on specific prints. Carolyn, if we could go to slide 2. This is Lowengrund. And Christina, I'd like to start with a question for you. The term disrupt is applied to Lowengrund more than once in the catalog. You say in the introduction that printmaking in the 1950s developed as a quote, slow and sometimes circuitous crescendo, end quote. Could you set the scene for the audience and describe the climate that prompted Lowengrund to open the Contemporaries?
Absolutely. Thank you, Jen. We do think of Lowengrund as a disruptor. I mean, it may seem a little anachronistic to apply that term to the 1950s, but she had this incredible ability to take a survey of her particular corner of the art world and find ways to remedy things that she felt were lacking. And so in this case, her background had been in printmaking. She had a sort of background where she went to art school. She grew up in Philadelphia, went to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts and Philadelphia School of Design for Women. She also came to New York and was at the Art Students League, and then had a little jaunt in Europe. And when she came back, she, in addition to starting a family, began working for the Works Progress Administration's Federal Art Project, and became very enmeshed in the artistic revival of lithography. And while she put all of those artistic desires on hold during the 1940s, as she really focused herself on becoming an art critic, she was nevertheless very aware of a sort of lack of workshop or resource or place for artists to use and learn all of the ins and outs of making a lithograph, which are quite technical, very chemical, very difficult for a novice. And there were a few places in 1940s New York to have a lithograph made, including contract printers like George Miller. But Lowengrund very much did not enjoy the process of working with George Miller, who she felt was a little bit heavy-handed in telling her how to make her prints. So with the opening of the Contemporaries in 1951, she hoped to breathe a little bit of life into this world and invite those who had a lot of familiarity with making prints and those who had very little to come and explore a new dimension of their creative process. And so she really did want to welcome people who had that background and those who were coming at it without, they were painters, they were known as sculptors, and they were to come in and kind of explore what making an etching or a lithograph or screen print was all about.
Thank you. And Jenn Bratovich, perhaps you could field this question. Better known contemporaries from the 1950s are the print entrepreneurs Tanya Grossman, who ran ULAE on Long Island, and June Weyl, who began Tamarind Lithography Workshop in Los Angeles. And Carolyn, would you mind scrolling forward to the next slide? We actually have a lithograph by Weyl here. Could you shed some light on the intersection between these figures and the differences between them and Lowengrund?
Ooh, that's a tough one for me. Thank you, Jen Field. So I'll start by saying
reach out for backup as needed.
Yeah, reach out for backup. So I guess I'll just sort of preface this by saying that one of the best things about my role at Print Center New York is that we work with guest curators for all of our curated exhibitions. And so I am constantly getting to work with curators like Lauren and Christina, who come in with this incredible subject matter expertise. And this is exactly one of those types of shows where over the several years that they've been working on this, and we've been working to support and realize their exhibition and publication, I have been learning from them a tremendous amount, because this is not my area of expertise, but it's like truly one of the joys of my job is that I get to learn from scholars like these. So June Weyl founded Tamarind. Curators helped me out, I believe, in 1959, great. And Tatiana Grossman founded ULAE, Universal Limited Art Editions, in 1960 as well.
1957.
1957, thank you. So June Weyl, Tatiana Grossman, and Margaret Lowengrund, I think the curators have thought of them as being discussed as this kind of triumvirate of women who were leading the way in this period, in this moment that we think of as anticipating this boom of interest in printmaking in the 1960s, particularly in the US. But what I think Lauren and Christina really do is position Lowengrund's work as really being a forerunner to the work that June Weyl and Tatiana Grossman would go on to do. And in particular, the June Weyl piece we're looking at here, which is in the exhibition, was shown at the Contemporaries, and June was moving through that network of artists, knew Margaret, and was really influenced by Margaret's way of setting up this space for artists and printers to work together and set a kind of stage for the kind of collaboration that we would see happening at the Contemporaries in print, and would really influence the way that she would go on to found her own workshop that would go on to be so incredibly instrumental. So, so thinking about Lowengrund as a kind of, I think, Christina, you called her a foremother to these others, and that's, I think, a really nice way of looking at it.
Seeing Weyl in this exhibition was a surprise to me, a very pleasant surprise, and I love this overlap. Jen, could you continue and describe how this exhibition fits into the broader vision for the Print Center at this particular moment?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned, we do only a couple of shows a year. We only have 2 that are guest curated. The third is for our emerging artist program. And so with so few slots, we really think hard about what kind of projects we want to support and what kind of stakes we want to claim in our exhibition program. And so what we're trying to do is support projects that have a curatorial vision that really work to expand our field. And so this project began, I think, in late 2019, early 2020, I think was one of the first proposals that crossed my desk when I started working at the Print Center 4 years ago. And we're interested in Christina's prior work on women working in New York, women master printmakers, and looking at how we could focus that lens in a little bit and pull on a kind of thread that had been, undiscovered. So when Lauren joined the team and Christina and Lauren decided to work on Margaret, this figure, what they were really doing was identifying a space where I guess you both could say more about it, but I guess, you kind of would you'd follow these little breadcrumbs and then hit almost a dead end, right? The research that was available, the publishing that was out there, it only could take you so far. And we saw that as a possibility for opening up a little corner of scholarship that hadn't been done yet. And so projects that do that kind of kick open a new area and that kind of challenge our thinking about an area of printmaking are the types of things that we want to support.
That touches on a question I was going to ask later, but this is a great place for it, is I would love to hear, and this takes us off course a little bit, we'll return to the art in a minute. I would love to hear about the research process in putting this exhibition together and what some of your key resources were. Lauren, perhaps you could speak to this, and folded into this question. I would love to know where the name The Contemporaries came from. I find it to be so unusual.
Thank you for having me. I'm not actually sure, Christina, maybe when I've done kind of talking about the research process, if you have any thoughts about where the Contemporaries came from. To be honest, Jen, I never quite questioned that title. In so many ways, it's come to be symbolic of what Lowengrund endeavored for presenting and making prints in the modern era that I never challenged or sought to find an answer to that question. That's a very good one. But perhaps that also sheds light on the challenges of this project overall. I think Christina and I, a number of years back, both identified a single archival box at the New York Public Library that was labeled The Contemporaries. And from there our brains started itching, and the curiosity was doubled when we both encountered her name in Clinton Adams' seminal book, American Lithographers, written over 30 years ago, I believe, if not closer to 40. And so with this little information and a kind of loose sense, but no real confidence in the actual works produced or shown at the Contemporaries, works made in the back workshop or presented in the front exhibition space, we set about any which way we could to try to identify the works and this extended network of colleagues. This began by reaching out to many of the museums that had print curators in the 1950s, seminal figures like Una Johnson at Brooklyn, Carl Koop at the New York Public Library to find works in their collections, and then an extended network of museums across the United States that may have kept record of having purchased from the Contemporaries, which we were delighted when we found. And then similarly, we followed any of these trails by seeking out artist papers, where not only were we able to reconstruct the elements of operations, but also the real character of Margaret Lowengrund as she engaged and fostered this network, a network of artists across the United States. And then the last major source for our archival research was the Rockefeller Archive Center, which holds the papers of the Rockefeller Foundation and Ford Foundation, two very important granting organizations to which Lowengrund would appeal for money time and time again and advocate her cause, really arguing in writing for the centrality of printmaking and its relevance in the modern era. And just as a side note, before I volley off to Christina, I want to add, just as we're looking at this image of June Wayne's prints, to reiterate what Jenn Bratovich mentioned, that it was Lowengrund time and time again that sought a quote unquote revival of lithography, a renaissance. These words were being used, Jen Field, as you likely know, in the 1950s. Yet it was June Wayne who titled her grant to the Ford Foundation, requesting money to, in fact, support a revival, the same exact word. So clearly there was a sense that a legacy after Margaret's death, Lowengrund's death, in the work of June Wayne. These were women who respected one another and were both advocates for printmaking.
Yes, and I would just add that I know, Jenn Field, that you poured into those boxes at the New York Public Library as well, looking for any scrap of information about Lowengrund, and there's really a paltry amount there, which is so unfortunate. So just to go back to your question about the Contemporaries, we don't really know where it came from. I do know that, the idea of contemporary modern was being very much debated at this moment. I'm not going to be able to put my hands on the resource, but there's a wonderful book sort of debating this idea of like what was modern, what was contemporary in relation to institutions like the Museum of Modern Art. And as a newspaper critic, Margaret covered, I think this might have been maybe the genesis, but I can't say for sure. She covered this sort of flashpoint where the Institute for Modern Art in Boston changed its name to the Institute for Contemporary Art. And that was in 1948. And it was somewhat provocatively announced with this sort of like Molotov cocktail like press release, because the Institute for Contemporary Art was like separating itself in a way from MoMA. And Margaret covered this in one of her columns for, I've forgotten which Woodstock newspaper, because she had a very devoted life up in Ulster County. And she talked about how modern and contemporary were different and the same, and like how there was this Venn diagram of how they overlapped in a way. And then so again, we don't really know. I would add there was also another gallery on 57th Street called Contemporary Arts, which made things a little bit tricky when Margaret opened the Contemporaries. And I think there was at least initially some confusion about whether the Contemporaries was somehow affiliated with Contemporary Arts.
Thank you. Carolyn, could you scroll to the next slide? And these are both works by Margaret Lowengrund, of course. As Christina mentioned, Lowengrund began her career in Philadelphia as an illustrator and a documentarian of local scenes and stories. And she moved to New York City to study at the Art Students League. It seemed to me from the exhibition and the catalog that by the mid-1950s, she had a much more expansive view, not only of the world, but of how to depict it. And some of the issues that appear in her work, in some ways they're a continuation, but in other ways they're sort of portrayed in radically different ways, having to do with industry, the changing cityscape of New York, and also labor. And I was struck by the similarities between these works dating over 10 years apart. The one on the left of illustrator and printmaker Joseph Pennell at an etching press from the mid-1920s, and the one on the right of workers in a brickyard. And there are, of course, similar elements in each image, the open factory windows, large wheels and gears, but more than that, there's a sense to me in both of these works of a shared collective labor. Lauren, in your essay, you illustrate a poster by Lowengrund for a color lithography workshop, and it immediately made me think of cover designs for the Marxist magazine New Masses, which you then went on to cite. Could you discuss the importance of the print workshop to Lowengrund as a site of collaboration and how it connected to her own socio-political interests and ideas of labor?
Sure, of course. So the image on the left made at the Art Students League really highlights the central figure of Pennell. And he himself had only arrived at the Art Students League 2 years prior, set about to reinvigorate the Intellia program and introduce American artists to lithography. And it was fortuitous that she arrived at this time to be embedded in a classroom with a figure who intended to upend training. And central to this new pedagogy was exposure, providing students exposure to industry and the innovations of commercial lithography, understanding what's to learn from observing and understanding the technicalities and the chemistry of the process. And then also the general milieu of the Art Students League, which encouraged students and teachers side by side. So issues of collaboration appeared on the technical level, on the collective level, but also on the social level, engaging in the print world at large out into New York City. And so Lowengrund's aware of these intersecting and overlapping elements to working in print and lithography in particular. I always find it kind of funny that it's a lithograph of an etching press. There's something a little silly in that, but and so by the time she arrives at the Graphic Arts Division, she's well aware of the processes, which stands in contrast to many of her colleagues, and puts her in a milieu where she's working with master printers. She's also gaining exposure to processes of color lithography. And whilst, as many know, the work of making lithographs often occurred in these artists' home studios, it was also being fostered in these collective spaces, the print shop itself, as well as on the city streets. And so while Lowengrund was not alone in necessarily taking up a social viewpoint or a politically oriented subject matter, it clearly, as you've identified, shows some continuity in the kinds of images that she's making. One of the other things I wanted to highlight here, which is a theme that we really tried to hone in on for this exhibition and really points to, or kind of is didactically explained in the title of the show, A Model Workshop, is that that Lowengrund had been exposed to these collaborative spaces, this collaborative process throughout her lifetime, and that she was able to draw upon these various experiences as she would go on to found the Contemporaries years later.
Thank you. Did Lowengrund ever acknowledge the influence or the activities of Mexican printmakers such as Posada, Orozco, Rivera, Siqueiros? It's my understanding they were showing in New York at Weyl Gallery during this time. Was there a known intersection?
Not that I know. Christina, do you recall having, we would glean that information from her own writings. As Christina mentioned, we've done the best we can. It would be, I think it's safe to say she would have been aware of the activities. She had written about Weyl Gallery and had connections there, Nusa Grosser and Carlza Grosser who worked there. And I would understand, Jen, that in the image of the poster or the advertising image, which you must see when you come see the exhibition, to all of you in the audience, it features this large hand, and it just owes such a visual debt to the ways in which laborers were essentialized in that way, and focusing on the hand and the hand of the printer worker.
Yeah, I don't think we know if she interacted directly with any of them. I just did a quick search. She covered them exhibiting in a small group show one summer, but besides that, that's it.
Thank you. Carolyn, would you mind scrolling to the next slide? Christina, the first work in the show that struck me when I visited the print center was Lowengrund's own lithograph, The Nest, here, which is markedly different from the representational style that I had associated with her. Even though her earlier prints can depict scenes from unusual angles, from very low or from very high, this one seems to enter a new territory for me in its flatness and its lack of a gravitational pull in the conventional sense. What were some of the steps that led her as an artist to move away from that narrative style and toward a work like this? Is this typical of her in the mid-50s?
So I know that Lauren can also speak more about Lowengrund's path in her printmaking practice, but she definitely did not make as many prints as her activities with the Contemporaries were ramping up. But we do have a handful of prints from the 1950s that we know about. Most of them are botanically oriented. So this being a tree branch in a way sort of fits with that, but there's also milkweed and other plants and hay, straw, things like that. For me, I've always looked at this print as sort of a way that Margaret was exploring color lithography. I mean, we know that she knew how to do it from the 1920s because we have an example of a color print that she made while she was in Europe of these boats along the Seine, these barge, like houseboat type things. But I don't think that she really was practicing all that much in color lithography. And to me, I love the different stones that she's using here, and that one in the background with the blue, turquoise blue, where there's a huge chunk of it missing. because that's just kind of the nature of these stones as they get passed from shop to shop to shop, is that they have these markers of their wear, you know. And so I've always loved that like Swiss cheese aspect of that particular stone. But no, it's the most abstracted thing that we had discovered in our research, and it is kind of a wonderful image. Lauren, I'm going to let you say anything else if you want to add.
I also love those chips in the stone, and they enhance the organicness of the subject matter. To me, it's sort of an extension of those eggs in the nest, and the color just pops. It's a really beautiful work. Do we have the next slide? So this slide pairs a lithograph by Edward Millman, who started as a social realist painter, with a newspaper clipping of Lowengrund overseeing Millman, I believe, pulling this print. Is that right, Christina? And could you explain where this clipping appeared and the significance of it?
Yeah, so this clipping came from the Woodstock Artists Association's archive. They have a small and interesting group of things about artists who were involved in the Artists Association. So the print by Millman served as what was called the bonus print that was given to artist members, I think in the summer of 1952. As we note in our catalog, the Contemporaries had a robust presence in New York at the workshop, hybrid workshop gallery that Lowengrund established. But then for 3 summers in 1952, 53, and 54, Lowengrund moved the Contemporaries seasonally to Woodstock, where they used the basement workshop that had at various points had other printmaking kind of projects happening in the basement, but it had been basically fallow and not used for a long time. So we believe the photograph that you see on the left of Millman kind of lifting the sheet from the stone is in the basement of the Woodstock Artists Association. And when I saw this, I, of course, in my mind, I was like, oh, we know that Margaret was serving as the quote master printer for this edition, and yet here she is very demurely standing beside or behind Millman as he's doing the final, you know, work, and the newspaper photographers there taking a picture of him doing all the labor. But we know through some letters that were exchanged between Millman and Lowengrund that she was really like in it doing all the work, and this was definitely just a staged photo for the press.
I'm reading her gaze here, which seems so hyper-focused on this print. To me, it reads like she just is making sure he's doing it right.
Yeah. Totally.
And maybe since you brought up Woodstock, this is a good chance to head a little bit, Carolyn, if you don't mind going to slide 11. Yes. These 2 lithographs hang next to each other in the exhibition for good reason. The Contemporaries opened on the Upper East Side in December of 1951, and at the Woodstock Art Association the following summer. And David Smith, who's represented by the lithograph on the right, was introduced to the Woodstock Art Association by his friend, the artist Herman Cherry, represented on the left. Smith spoke in 1947 at the first annual Woodstock Art Conference. So he was no stranger to the site, to this location, but he made his first lithographs there in 1952. That would have been the first season that Lowengrund operated this workshop. And this lithograph and others he made at the time have to do with language, with indecipherability, language as code, and it's very much related to what he was working through in his drawings and sculptures at the time. So I'm wondering, Christina or Lowen, or sorry, Christina or Lauren, could you describe in a bit more detail the importance of the Woodstock location to Lowengrund? Why there? And who were some of the artists working there, and what were some of the unconventional methods that were being used in the basement?
Well, I'll start with the famous story related to this print, and then perhaps pass it off, Christina, to zoom out a little bit on the milieu. So by the time Lowengrund moves upstate to run the summer Contemporaries, she's already hired an additional printer. She consistently through her tenure had great ambitions, which included bringing in specialists who worked in the various media. And she hires Michael Ponce de Leon, who had trained with Peterty in Intaglio and was kind of a young gun, really enthusiastic and excited about working at this hub, of contemporary printmaking. And setting up shop, she, as Christina mentioned, was working with less than ideal conditions. If you know lithography, it requires running water, which the basement of the Woodstock Artists Association lacked. That's not to say that professional printers couldn't have worked in that space. Grant Arnold was there as master printer working in the basement from 29 to 50. So it clearly he was able to produce very outstanding work. Nevertheless, as the story goes, as recounted in Quentin Adams's book, is that Lowengrund has Ponce de Leon meet Smith for a morning session, though Jen Field, you would better than any of us know if David Smith actually kept morning hours. I'm not entirely sure if that would have been the case. Nevertheless, the story goes that Ponce de Leon and Smith arrived before Lowengrund at the shop. And just the day before, Lowengrund has instructed Ponce de Leon how to work in lithography since his training was elsewhere. And eager to get going, the two men start their day printing. And rather than using water, which would have been found outside in the running brook in the back, the two men start using the beer that they'd already begun drinking to improve their prints. Now, the story itself is really wonderful. If that were the end, the rest of the story goes that Lowengrund arrives and quite upset, pulling the men aside and giving them a great scolding, reinforcing a kind of gendered dynamic of the two men in work and the woman kind of making sure everything is running in order. And while the story may be hyperbole, it really does, though, indicate the spirit of innovation that she was also fostering, that she really respected the artist and the artist's work. She had numerous artists around her, those who worked in the Woodstock style. She had been living part-time upstate since the mid-1930s and cultivated a large network of artists, many of whom were women as well. She had cultivated a large network and always appreciated diversity of style. That was and we hope that becomes very apparent in our exhibition, whether they be Woodstock-based artists or not. Christina, do you want to take over and kind of talk a little bit more about the milieu?
Sure. I mean, I think Margaret very much knew the ins and outs of the art worlds in both locales, as a functioning really as an art critic for the Woodstock artist community and in New York City at large. But as Lauren alluded to, it was really a diversity of styles. And in 1954, she welcomed also Reginald Neal, who was an artist who was very familiar to her, to serve as the printer for the Woodstock summer. And he was in particular very skilled with color lithography. And so a lot of the prints that you see come out of Woodstock that summer are color, but that doesn't really negate the fact that she was just really opening the doors to her community. And so artists as varied as the ones that you see here, as well as, Alexander Archipenko, Marion Greenwood, and who else? Andrew Rowellen, her husband, John Taylor. So, a diverse crew.
That's a great place to go back to slide 7, if you could, Carolyn. So because the prints in this exhibition span 4 decades, from the 1920s to the mid-60s, and because of this diversity that Lowengrund was cultivating, naturally there's a broad variety here in the content and style represented in the exhibition. Jenn Bratovich, this is a question for you. Was this a challenge for the Print Center to accommodate this variation? I know you're working with a new building. What are some of the display innovations that you employed or discovered in the process to adequately represent Lowengrund and everything that she was accomplishing?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was a challenge, and I think, you know, it's a challenge, of course, from the start, simply deciding how to winnow down. I mean, the amount, Lauren and Christina worked on this for like 4 years, and even this morning I was listening to some interviews that they've done recently on some print podcasts, look them up, about the show, and I'm still learning more layers of the research. So now when I think about the show, I think there's so much more there, and our space is not that big. So even just thinking about how to tell this story succinctly in a room that's 2,000 square feet was a challenge from the start. And I think there's 79 works on the wall. There's a sculpture, and then there's ephemera. So to tell a story that would move chronologically through the space, and kind of highlight the extremely wide variety of activities that Lowengrund was doing at the Contemporaries, and then that Pratt Graphic Arts Center was doing after the Contemporaries transitions into Pratt Graphic Arts Center, was a challenge. And then to also just accommodate, as you say, Jen, the stylistic diversity of the objects in the room, and making sure that they hung together in a way that that was, you know, legible and that would really take you inside this period. What we ended up doing was we organized the show into 3 sections. So the first, when you first walk in, introduces Lowengrund and her own work, and kind of situates her work as an artist and printmaker and as a critic. And then as you move into the space that you see here, the kind of large space of our gallery, we set up this set of temporary walls that kind of bisect the space and have this, like, these 2 winged panels that you see here. One with this great image of Margaret that kind of does some very, I think, evocative placemaking. This is her inside of the Contemporaries in the 50s. And then you kind of move around, you kind of move clockwise through the room as you, around these temporary walls, and move through the chronology of the story that way. And the walls were kind of the biggest challenge to deal with, and figure out how to do this in a room that was not so large, but to create extra wall space for all of these objects, and to make the storyline as coherent as we could. And we ended up with these very beautiful kind of almost floating walls that nod to some of the gallery design and exhibition style of the period, in this kind of elegant way that don't feel, you know, super claustrophobic in the space. And then I think one thing that is really nice, and that is that a surprising number of people have really picked up on as they come through the space, and I chat with them after, is that we really tried to highlight the way that this section on the Contemporaries is installed. It really kind of takes you into how it would have felt to be in this space in the 50s. So the way that these walls have been hung, some of the strategies here kind of nod to some of those methods of display as well that would have been familiar to Margaret's own time in the Contemporaries. And I think as you move through the space, you can kind of feel these methods of display changing in a way that helps propel the story forward.
Beautifully installed, and I really get that sense of a natural flow. There's no one part of this installation that feels like it wasn't given equal attention, equal weight compared to others. So
Yeah,
and it's
yeah,
a beautiful shot, because I wanted to discuss the use of color and the presence of sculpture and painting at the Contemporaries, and we can see here on the left some examples of that. It's a really daring use of color lithography that seems to appear early on. And Carolyn, could you go to the next slide? We can see this Colescott a little more clearly next to an Adjunker's woodcut. So Christina or Lauren, perhaps you could speak to the range of the print techniques that Lowengrund was encouraging at the Contemporaries. It wasn't just about lithography. There were other print mediums being encouraged here, and the relationship, especially with sculpture, that she was cultivating in the gallery.
You want me to go, Lauren? Take it. Okay. All right. Yeah, so Margaret had staff members as the Contemporaries got running. She had staff members who helped to facilitate teaching woodcut, teaching screen print, teaching lithography, and other mixed media, I think is what she termed it. Combination of everything, I think. And what really defined what was coming out of the Contemporaries was this color, I think. It was slowly picking up steam in the 40s as artists were kind of getting away from the thought of the print as this black and white image that was both a lithograph or it might be an etching, and exploring all the technical innovations that made these color images possible. And so in particular, this Warrington Colescott is amazing. It's like, I don't know how many, it's actually, I think it's a screen print and not a lithograph. Yeah, Lauren is shaking her head, yes. And it probably has 20 colors, and they're all these beautiful layers on top of one another that create these interplay of different tones. So that in itself is worth going to see in the gallery. But I think I'm digressing from your question, Jen Field. It was a place where Margaret really wanted to support the best quality. It did not matter to her what style was or what the technique was. She, as I think you get a sense on that wall, was willing to show just about anything as long as technically it was well made, you know.
And just to jump in to reiterate Christina's observation, and something that really defines the work being presented is Lowengrund's eye for defining the Contemporaries in print through innovation, whether it be a kind of subject matter, but more so through technique. She really was drawn. We highlight in the exhibition the printmaking instructors like Junkers, those who received solo exhibitions, whose work she really kind of invested a lot more of her space to, her gallery space to, including June Lane and Colescott here, as well as an exhibition called Outlook 55 that brings together the best of the year. And time again, we're seeing artists, Christina and I were observing artists who really took process and to its fullest and brought it in new directions. And Colescott, working out of Wisconsin at this time, was among a bunch of artists there thinking through the kind of inks, number of screens, and dynamism in color, as well as something we saw time and time again, which is increased scale. Now, for the Junkers, he had been working in woodcut for decades, 2 decades already, by the time he arrived in the United States at the outbreak of war, had taught at a new school, and had established himself in New York City as a master in his field. And it's only a year later that he himself creates his masterwork in 1953, 5 panels from 28 blocks and 56 colors overall, the polyptych. So while we weren't able to show that work since it was not exhibited at the Contemporaries, she clearly knew and was observing innovation and technical and formal at the same time, and was really supporting that work and promoting it as contemporary.
Carolyn, could you scroll one forward? this is another work that I find so interesting by Saburo Hasegawa. This story is not in either of your essays, it's in Noriko's essay, but they recount how Hasegawa walked into the Contemporaries by mistake, and Lowengrund seized the opportunity to convince the artist to make prints there and to hang them in an exhibition that was about to open at Riverside Church, and then gave him a solo show. And we can see it, I believe, advertised in the window of that exterior shot of the Contemporaries that we saw early on. What was the significance of this moment? The group exhibition that the prints were hung in it featured a large number, comparatively, of Japanese artists. Was Lowengrund at this particular moment interested in expanding her roster on an international scale? Did she have that kind of ambition at this time for the Contemporaries? I was struck by this lithograph also because it, to me, resembles a woodcut, and I love the writing on it too. So it's sort of bridging, printed word with printed image and merging them. Christina?
Yeah, so I think we were really fortunate to partner with a great scholar of mid-century Japanese printmaking, Noriko Kurihara, and she sort of helped fill in a lot of these gaps. So I'm definitely cribbing from her. Margaret, there was an increased traffic between the United States and Japan after World War II ended. And many Japanese artists were coming on exchange programs to and from. So we began to notice these names coming up again and again. And it was very unusual for Margaret to give the full gallery to an artist. It only ever happened a couple of times. Usually what she would do is she would have works on paper, prints and drawings, or sometimes paintings on the walls, and then she would have a second artist showing sculpture. So Hasegawa is an occasion when the whole gallery became his solo show. And I think it is really interesting that this does look like a woodcut, because that's obviously what Japan and Japanese printmaking was traditionally based in, was relief printmaking. However, Margaret tried to convince Hasegawa that he should make a lithograph, and he did produce, I think, 5 or 6. And they're not they weren't ever really printed in large numbers. So we're very fortunate to borrow this from MoMA. But I think there was always this hope that if you taught enough artists how to make a lithograph, that they would go home and sort of begin another node of activity in Japan. That didn't, it sounds to me from what I've heard from Noriko, like that didn't happen exactly. But I think there were a number of artists who were trying this new technique, new for them.
And to allow time for questions, let's scroll forward, Carolyn, to slide 12, if you don't mind. Because I want to make sure we have time to discuss the Contemporaries becoming Pratt Contemporaries in August 1956. And we now know that this merger would essentially seal Lowengrund's legacy. Lauren, could you describe the reasons behind the merger and how that changed the identity of the Contemporaries? And where was Pratt located? Because now we associate Pratt with Brooklyn, but Pratt Contemporaries was in Manhattan, wasn't it?
Sure. So even before the Contemporaries evolved into a joint endeavor alongside Pratt, Lowengrund faced a couple of factors that changed her organization quite practically. The first was a demolition of the first space in which she occupied the second floor. that brought together the workshop and gallery. So upon learning of this, she sets about needing to move both endeavors, and the Contemporaries ends up splitting between a space dedicated to the gallery and then a second space, which was at up the street on Madison Avenue, and then a second space for the workshop on 3rd Avenue. So even still, we've kind of changed the model of workshop within her lifetime and under her purview. At the same time, she's thinking quite in a focused way about solidifying the financial foundation of her project, and begins discussions with the Rockefeller Foundation about grant support. She'd also alternately have been discussions with various universities about bringing together their efforts. So those are all conversations and strains happening at the same time. She eventually strikes up a kind of understanding with Fritz Eichenberg, head of the Department of Graphic Arts at Pratt, who really sees what the work she's doing and understands how innovative it is. And through that partnership, she's able to get nonprofit join in with Pratt to create a nonprofit status for the Contemporaries. It becomes Pratt Contemporaries, and for a while the workshop itself stays at its 3rd Avenue location. The gallery is also sold to an independent dealer who retains the name. Now, as Christina mentioned at the beginning, Lowengrund's also quite ill at this time, already confronting symptoms related to her diagnosis of cancer. So there is that motivation at the same time. So this partnership is struck, and she passes away soon after, leaving Fritz Eichenberg to really shepherd the next decades of what would eventually become the Pratt Graphic Arts Center into its new iteration. The workshop moves further downtown on Broadway and creates its new life for itself there. It also, as you were kind of hinting at, has a changed identity, really taking on an educational initiative, continuing its relationship with many of the printers who had worked with Lowengrund at the initial Contemporaries, but bringing on the faculty from Pratt, taking on students, an international cast of students who were attracted to Pratt through support from various foundations as well. And then also doing a robust program of edition printing, one of which you see here with the Cleve Gray. And as the Pratt Graphic Arts Center, there is also a real embrace in the of a changed art world in the 1960s, bringing into its fold conceptual artists, pop artists, minimalist artists, sustaining an interest in variety of style, but really understanding that there are more and more artists now interested in print and lithography, because we have now entered in the 1960s into the print boom and the revival. And this enthusiasm from the art world in attracting artists was ideal for Pratt, and it really took advantage of that.
Thank you. And if we could scroll forward one slide, sort of emblematic of that transformative moment. These are 2 prints that are not in the exhibition, but it was Cleve Gray, who we saw represented by the previous lithograph, who had suggested that Barnett Newman make his first lithographs at Pratt in 1961. And this exercise helped to cure him of a long creative block, and it led to important new directions in his career in other mediums, such as working serially and collaboratively. But the medium was challenging for him because of the margins, and in his painting, of course, the color field where he would paint even around the edges of the canvas was essential, and he couldn't escape those margins here in lithography. But very important for Newman's own career in particular. Jenn or Christina, could you cite other examples of artists either in this exhibition or more generally who experienced similar challenges when they first came to lithography? I think now it's such a common medium for artists working in many different, in painting and in sculpture, and it's printmaking is sort of known and accepted now, but back then it had distinct challenges for artists in other mediums. Are there any other examples, or was there a kind of friction, and why were the 1960s so important for these artists embracing printmaking on such a robust scale? It's a big question.
I know. I'm going to ask Lauren to unmute as well.
Well,
Maybe we can all get at it together. Yeah, we'll all try.
The example that comes to mind is the artists Louise Kamnitzer and Eliana Porter, who would go on to found the New York Graphic Workshop.
And you can scroll forward. I'm sorry to interrupt, Carolyn. She's actually represented here. Might be easier.
Both artists coming from Latin America and the continent, brought together by happenstance at the Graphic Arts Center, which by the time of their arrival had an international renown. Part of Eichenberg's genius is maybe overstatement, acumen, perhaps is the better word, was the founding of Artist Proof Journal in 1961, which aggregated stories about workshops around the world, and also, as Christina likes to say, was a house organ in promoting its own capacities to the rest of the world. And so by this point, in the mid-60s, it is very well known. It is a hot spot for activity. And so Kamnitzer, Porter arrive having developed their own practices already and ready to learn. And soon after, there is this understanding that, in their estimation, the idea of innovation and technical innovation that had been so central to defining what made the contemporaries contemporary had perhaps hardened a bit and became the kind of mechanism for production against which they intended to rebel. And the founding of the New York Graphic Workshop, so eloquently described by Rachel Vogel in a contributing essay, really positions some of their strong independent conceptual work as in dialogue with what they were observing at Pratt Graphic Arts Center. So while the 60s allowed figures like Newman to innovate within the bounds of the workshop, it also propelled others away with an invigorated spirit to work against it.
That was my example as well. And, Artist Proof, as Lauren mentioned, this publication of PGACs would be the place that Kamnitzer and the Graphic Workshop, the New York Graphic Workshop, would kind of publish these manifestos, if you will, of their own kind of conceptual underpinnings of printmaking. And for them, what became most important was this sense of gesture, of editioning, and of the capacity to reproduce a thing, and rather than kind of technical processes. So almost a reversal of, I think, what Lauren and Christina have really drawn out in their work on this project, of how the 50s was really interested in these technical innovations in print. It's almost like by the time Kamnitzer and Porter are working on New York Graphic Workshop, we see kind of a swing the opposite direction and thinking more about the conceptual potential for the print, where they say even the slicing of a sausage could be considered a print gesture because of its repetition, or looking in a mirror could be considered a repetition in line with printmaking. So it really kind of, swings dramatically. And it's really interesting that it's a kind of at Pratt that these things are pivoting around.
I feel like that opening up is a great place to move on to our next slide and start to think about closing. I know this is reproduced because Lauren and Christina, I know you wanted to discuss this today, and then so you're aware the next slide is Michael Ponce de Leon. So if you'd like to discuss these two prints, and then we can open up to questions.
Sure. So one thing that came up time and again as we were talking with artists who both worked, like literally made prints at the PJC, but also people who were workshop monitors or were helping with the production of Artist Proof, the biannual journal that PJC published, was just the opportunity to get a sense of what was going on in the print field internationally. And one artist in particular was like, it was so cool. I was this young guy, I was working on Artist Proof, and like in the flip bins, they would have David Hockney's most recent etchings, and that was just such an opportunity to see these currents of the print world come together in a way that had not happened before. And this work, along with the Liliana Porter, were included in a very important exhibition that was held at the Jewish Museum in 1963, I think, called 100 Contemporary Prints. It was all work that had been made by Pratt Graphic Arts Center, and it was this really interesting slice of emerging tendencies. So you have a lot of pop artists. Jim Dine was in it, Klaus Oldenburg. These artists all kind of came and made some of their first prints at PJC alongside people who were teaching and longstanding teachers in the print field, or as we alluded to before, Chemnitzer and Porter were also included among many, many artists from Latin America who shared their approaches to sort of the conceptual aspects of printmaking.
That's great. Carolyn, could you scroll forward one more slide and maybe we can close on this one? Lauren, would you like to comment on the significance of this print?
Sure. I have to say, when we encountered this print in the collection of the Whitney Museum, I think in so many ways it came to be emblematic of what we had come to understand the Contemporaries to be, which was a site of individual people committed to the field. This print was made by Ponce de Leon and the Contemporaries Workshop members as a thank you gift to one of the artists who had certainly exhibited, but likely printed in that space as well, B. Grover. And we really got a sense that the workshop was a real place in seeing this, that was really, fostered by Lowengrund, but inhabited by all those with deep investment in printmaking in the 1950s at the time of its making. And so we feature this on a central wall next to the picture of Lowengrund to really draw people in and put names to artworks and emphasize the kind of spirit that inhabited the space of the show and the workshops.
Well, thank you all very much. I think this was a really dynamic talk. And Carolyn, thank you for your help with the slides. And I will turn the conversation back over to the Rail to field questions from the audience.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for this conversation today. We do have a few questions here, and I'm going to ask the first on behalf of Phyllis McGibbon. So their question is, I was surprised / pleased to see the UW-Madison faculty members Dean Meeker and Warrington Colescott's work included in this show, and wondered how Lowengrund was coming into contact with printmakers so far from East Coast and NYC. I haven't yet seen your catalog, so I'm wondering how you think large open call juried shows played a role in bringing experimental printmakers together.
I can start, but there's so much there, Christina. Maybe I'll go off in one direction. I believe it was, so a handful of things. The question already touches on one of the answers, in that in this time period, there were a number of other key figures who were doing a kind of allied work or similar work to Lowengrund. One was the large annuals by Luna Johnson at Brooklyn, as well as the Cincinnati annuals being organized by Gustav von Groschwitz that were juried and robust and important in coming to define the field, from which we believe, or we argue, that Lowengrund adopted a model in order to do a similar kind of work on her own. There was also a long-standing history of printmaking groups throughout the United States, usually often or typically centered around the region, the Midwest, California, the Northwest, that was doing similar work as well. Often juried as well, bringing together the best in that region. Lowengrund and other figures like Weyl and many of the people who were exhibiting eventually at the Contemporaries had been involved in this network. And then lastly, I believe it was Meeker who was a member of the Serigraph or had exhibited at the Serigraph Society, which was in New York City. Like many artists who were not based in New York, there was oftentimes a drive to go to New York City and see what's happening, observe and learn, whether it is at the site of someone like Miller or with an alliance or allegiance with like a gallery like the Serigraph Society. We know that he showed there and then showed with Lowengrund, but a year later. I think it can be said with, if we have a Wisconsinite here who could tell us and affirm this, is that the faculty and the department at University of Wisconsin was gaining in reputation, was very well known, and their innovation, their technical innovation, was admired from afar by many. Christina, do you have anything else?
No, the only thing I would add is that Margaret, when she started the gallery program, very much realized that group shows, very large group shows, were the best way of raising the collective stature of contemporary printmaking. And so there were these open calls where she was probably mailing entry forms to, although we've never found one, to artists across the country and to particularly these university print programs. So my guess is it was also probably through some of that outreach that she made contact with Dean Meeker and the others. There was a specific Midwest printmaking exhibition that happened sometime when the gallery was still just getting started. So that's something to take a look at. There's an appendix in the back of the catalog which lists all the shows that happened at the Contemporaries. So that is definitely listed there.
Great. Thank you so much, Phyllis, for that question. Thank you all for answering. Our next question is from Sato Yamamoto, and I can, you are unmuted now. You should be able to ask.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Sorry, my face is not photogenic now, so I'm sorry not showing. And I appreciate I am PCNY gallery about this event sharing, and I hope Jenn-san still remember me. Thank you very much. I see Tiffany-san tomorrow, by the way. And anyway, I have a question about more like popularity of a technique. Sometime like I visit the IFPDA fair this year, and my understanding is I don't see much straightforward circus screening artwork or anything, and even like a single leg, not many galleries saying like a straightforward etching or something. So and I see a lot lithograph this year actually too. So it's very non-professional question, I apologize, but I'm wondering if like every year some popularity of printmaking technique for the real collector cells or anything. If somebody have a knowledge, I'd like to learn by. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your question. I do think that these techniques go in waves. And I think if you take a look at like the whole 20th century, you'll see that etching is on the rise, and then in the 30s, lithographs on the rise, and then etchings go down a little bit. And then woodcut, kind of comes up in the 50s. So, I think what you see at the print fair, which happened last week, the New York IFPD print fair, is just a slice in time of what is being made now. There are certain shops that do specialize in particular techniques. Not everyone is equipped to take and do everything. There's only a handful that are equipped to do all processes. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but it's an interesting one of how things ebb and flow over time.
Or sorry, Sato, you can unmute if you need.
Thank you very much. I think I'd like to practice many other technique of even small few artwork or something. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. Thank you, Christina. So our last question is from Daniel in the audience, and I'm going to ask on their behalf. Daniel's wondering, is there any documentation of Grossman visiting the Contemporaries or engaging with Lowengrund as part of her path towards founding ULA?
I'm going to take this one. This is one of my most favorite things that we found. So ULAE, Universal Limited Art Editions, I may have misspoke. I think it was 1956 or 57. So don't quote me. Continues to be this really amazing print shop. But when the owners, the founders were just getting started, Tatiana Grossman and her husband Maurice, they were mostly silk screening reproductions of drawings that were given to them by their artist friends. And both of them, did this throughout the 50s. She would sell them, he would make them. And then sometime just after the middle of that decade, they got the idea that maybe this wasn't the best idea and this wasn't the direction that printmaking was going, and that they should explore instead producing original editions. So things that were made specifically for lithograph or as an etching. So what's considered the first print is this really long and beautiful print by Mary Callery that's on handmade paper that was made by Douglas Howell. And it's a kind of drawing of one of her sculptures called The Sons of Morning. And as we were really diving into all the archival things, we found these installation pictures of the gallery when it had moved to 77th and Madison to this new ground floor space. And lo and behold, there it is, the Mary Callery Sons of Morning, just underneath one of the windows. And so I don't think we know specifically if Grossman and Margaret met, but I think it's probably a pretty sure bet that they did. And I think that Margaret was a sort of beacon for Tatiana to know that this was the direction that she should go in. This was the path forward.
It really brings us back to this question earlier about how Margaret fit into this landscape of these other groundbreaking women of this period. She's really something.
Absolutely. And I would love to at some point go out to ULAE, and I know that they have some records of where their editions sold, and see whether any of those prints or others, Mary Callery's or others, were sold at the Contemporaries. I think that would be a great thing to find out.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you everyone for your questions. And thank you again so much for this conversation today. So here at the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm thrilled to welcome Chloe Stagman, who we're so lucky to have as our Director of Programs here at the Rail. Over to you, Chloe.
Hi, everybody. It's been an absolute pleasure listening to this conversation today. Thank you so much for your words. And I can't wait to see the exhibition soon. I'm going to read a couple of poems by Adrienne Rich. And I'm going to start with a poem in the spirit of handiwork called Well in Ruined Courtyard. Down this old well, what leaves have fallen, what cores of eaten apples, what scraps of paper, an old trash barrel, November, no one comes. But I come, trying to breathe that word into the well's ear, which should make the leaves fly up like a green jet to clothe the naked tree, the whole fruit leap to the bough, the scraps like fleets of letters sail up into my hands. And I'm going to close with a poem in the spirit of community called In Those Years. In those years, people will say we lost track of the meaning of we, of you. We found ourselves reduced to I, and the whole thing became silly, ironic, terrible. We were trying to live a personal life, and yes, that was the only life we could bear witness to. But the great dark birds of history screamed and plunged into our personal weather. They were headed somewhere else, but their beaks and pinions drove along the shore, through the rags of fog, where we stood, saying I. Back to you, Carolyn.
Thank you so much, Chloe, for reading Adrienne to us today. And thank you all again so much for this event. Thank you, Jenn, Christina, Lauren, and Jenn for hosting. We also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. For the past 23 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our free monthly publication and public events like our daily NSE. Please check the chat for a link to donate to support the Rail. Join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a poetry reading curated by Lucia Hinojosa Gacciola, featuring Carolina Ebede, Maritza N. Estrada, Tilsa Ota, and Zhou Ying Peng. And as is Rail tradition, you can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you all again so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming. Thank you so much for coming.
Good job.
That was
Thanks, everyone. Great conversation today.
Thank you, Christina.
Thanks, Charlie.
Happy Halloween. Bye.
Thank you.
Hi, Deb.
Great reading.
everybody.
All right, thank you so much.
Congratulations.